This week, thousands of undocumented immigrants lined up to register for a new program that could keep them from being deported. Now, these are pictures from the registration lines just from Chicago. It's all part of President Obama's so-called DREAM Act. 1 million illegal immigrants could be eligible for that program. It gives them the legal rights to work in America for 2 years without fear of deportation. Author Aaron Klein says, you better get ready. President Obama is going to grant amnesty to illegals if he's elected to a second term. Aaron Klein's new book is called Fool Me Twice. Aaron, welcome to the show. Good to have you here.
Thank you for having me.
Let's talk about this really remarkable process that Obama has put into place. He just sort of bypassed Congress. You say in your book that if President Obama is reelected, we better just get ready for a wave of illegal people coming here. Why?
Yeah, I mean, if this is what Obama has already done with his first term when he faces re-election, can you imagine what he's going to do in his second term? Well, actually, I don't have to imagine. I've gone through thousands of documents and have really divined some of what will be President Obama's second term blueprint, his plans for his second term, including on amnesty. We're talking about specific plans for what's known as executive order amnesty, also interagency directives that would basically grant millions more illegals de facto amnesty. I mean, we're talking, for example, about defining something called a vulnerable population, which would be basically any illegal, undocumented immigrant within the United States that has a salary and that has dependents, family members. Well, that kind of defines pretty much every illegal living within the U.S. And that's just to start. There could also be executive orders, and there are plans for this, to identify all sorts of what is known as community-based organizations, faith-based organizations, which would mean that anybody from a church, from a synagogue, who visits a healthcare facility, if you're in a cemetery, you can actually run to a cemetery or a university. That's just the beginning.
Well, people are dying to get in those cemeteries, Aaron, so that may be the case. So that very
well, here they're going to be staying in the U.S. if they get into a cemetery. Healthcare facility, that's just the beginning of where they cannot be deported from. And this, while, by the way, plans also to tie border agents, border patrol, and that's just the beginning.
Aaron, where does this come from? These are ideas that they just don't seem to make sense to most of us who say, I thought that the purpose of the president and the government was to enforce the laws, not to figure out how to circumvent them or even to ignore them or to unilaterally just dismiss them even without legislative approval. Where is this philosophical base coming from?
This is coming from the progressive organizations, the progressive think tanks that were actually behind much of President Obama's first term agenda. I mean, Obama came to office promising hope and change, and then, of course, to transform the country. Nobody bothered to ask, what do you mean by transformation? Well, these same progressive groups that helped to craft the stimulus, such as the Center for American Progress, such as the Economic Policy Institute, the Institute for Policy Studies, a slew of these progressive think tanks that are heavily tied to the White House. In fact, actually, John Podesta of the Center for American Progress directed Obama's transition into the office, into the White House, and then helped to craft the stimulus bill. Apollo Alliance, part of what crafted not only the stimulus, but eventually what became an Economic Policy Institute, Obama's health care bill. So these same progressive organizations have been heavy at work. I've reviewed thousands of documents of what they're planning for Obama's second-term assault. And by the way, it's not just amnesty. We're also talking once these undocumented, what they call undocumented workers in the U.S. are newly legal, the next plan is to then, and use government funds for this, to register them to vote. Obviously, if we're nudging closer and closer toward a welfare system on which they're dependent, they're probably going to vote Democrat.
Well, that would certainly make a little bit of sense to it. The book is explosive, and I want to get into some more aspects of it, particularly some of the specific things in job creation that, according to your book, are very different than what most of us think job creation would be all about. Remember when the president said the private sector was fine? He went on to say this.
The big challenge we have in our economy right now is state and local government hiring has been going in the wrong direction.
So, are your tax dollars going to foot more state and local jobs? That's what Aaron and I are going to talk about when we return. We'll be right back. We are back with Aaron Klein. He's got a brand new book out called Fool Me Twice, available at Amazon, bookstores everywhere. In the book, you predict that instead of focusing on private sector jobs, which when most of us think jobs, that's what we're thinking, you say President Obama is more likely to put a focus on federal jobs, like the old FDR New Deal prospects.
Yeah, I mean, it's amazing that the Works Progress administration of the early 20th century is going to be coming back, but in a new version, should Obama get a second term. Again, this is part of his plans. And that's just the tip of the iceberg of not only massive government spending, including in a second-term green stimulus, including in a national infrastructure bank, including in a massive government jobs works program, but also, and if you take a step back and look at all of the plans that I've laid out in Fool Me Twice, what it translates into is government centralization, is the centralization of our government in our lives. For example, Obama constantly talks about economic fairness, but just like transforming the country, no reporter bothered to ask him, well, what do you mean by economic fairness? What is that? The fair share? What do you mean? I actually found second-term plans for something called paycheck fairness, where the government, the federal government, could determine what is the fair salary for individual jobs in the private sector.
I wonder if that's going to go to some of his Hollywood pals, if George Clooney is going to have to take a pay cut in order to equal out to the people who are grips and electricians and some of the camera operators on the set.
You know, at the end of the day, I actually think that the top 1%, if that's what Occupy wants to call them, will probably not be as affected as the middle class. Obama constantly talks about fighting for the middle class, but it seems what he's trying to do is create a welfare class, dependency on the government, and paycheck fairness, just the start. We're also talking about something, again, this is in the second-term blueprint, if Obama gets his second term, living wage fairness, where the U.S. government would come in and raise the minimum wage. But this comes actually straight from Marxist ideology, so that every individual worker can pay for his fair share of food, of housing, of health care. Now, this actually sounds really good. If I'm a private worker, wow, the government's going to come in and raise my paycheck. The problem is it's been tried before, including in the 1990s, actually until 2003, pushed, by the way, by Acorn, by a voter fraud Acorn with which Obama had some previous connections. And it didn't work. It caused local economies in over 80 cities across the country to crash and burn. It created this anti-business climate. And so that's what we're up against here. It's free enterprise on the one hand versus what Obama wants to do to our economy if he gets a second term, and that is massive, massive government centralization.
Aaron, these are pretty explosive charges. You talk about the blueprint that Obama would implement. How do we know this? What is the source? I mean, what is it? If I'm the skeptic and I'm saying, okay, you're making all these allegations, that's pretty big stuff, where does that come from?
So, as I said before, the exact same progressive groups that have been behind Obama's first-term agenda, where he has been very unclear to the American public about what he will do in a second term, the people who helped to craft the stimulus, the people who helped to craft parts of Obama's health care legislation, who are behind what he actually did with regard to amnesty. And I'm actually literally talking about crafting parts of what became the words, the phraseology of the stimulus legislation. Well, they have been hard at work for years, really, at trying to push a progressive agenda, and here at recommending specifically to what Obama should do during his second term. Now, I'm not saying that Obama is going to come in and implement everything 100% as it's written in Fool Me Twice, but there's no question this is the blueprint. And this is the blueprint, by the way, that Obama does not want Americans to know. He's running on very general terms again. I don't understand why he doesn't give a speech where he announces his specific plans, although now I see why, and that is because no American, Democrat or Republican, this is not about one party or the other, partisan politics. The American public will very likely not support these specific plans if they know about them.
You're talking about in the same way, let's say that the Heritage Foundation typically will help Republicans craft model legislation, concepts and ideas that the Center for American Progress and these groups that are really far to the left, not a little bit, they're pretty far to the left, have been crafting the very model legislation. You've seen it with your own eyes. You know that this is exactly the agenda. Again, not that it's going to all get implemented, but this is the goal.
This is the blueprint, because I actually wrote a previous book where I went through also thousands of documents and traced back who was behind Obama's first term agenda, and I was shocked by how specifically, how directly they were involved. And you can actually see time and again when different Obama administration officials resign, they then go and pop up again working for these progressive organizations, including, by the way, Van Jones, communist now working at the Center for American Progress, and others. And what's amazing is you look at this stunning corruption that is coming from Obama's first term, for example, the green stimulus. And so a second green stimulus and a second plan, and that's just the tip of the iceberg of plans on the military, shock slashes to the U.S. military, healthcare legislation, including nudging closer toward more government centralization and a single-payer system, and so much more on every field. This is the blueprint.
Well, the book is explosive, and I'm sure it's going to be controversial. That's why you need to read it for yourself, draw your own conclusions. Aaron Klein, thanks for being here. The book, again, is called Fool Me Twice.